What you see here are the sand hills of North Carolina, where you'll find a vast forest of longleaf and loblolly pines and dry, sandy soil. The sand is here because millions of years ago, this used to be a vast, shallow sea, with sand and clay deposited by ancient rivers that carried runoff from the mountains. But what all that sand meant for human beings is that the land could not be farmed. In the otherwise fertile Carolina coastal plain, this was the one place nobody wanted. What do you do with land like this? Well, if you're James Walker Tufts, you buy it on the cheap and you make a resort. And then you bring in the designer Donald Ross, and within just a few years, he turns it into one of America's greatest golf destinations, Pinehurst, the host of this year's US Open. It has gone from the place nobody wanted to the place everybody wants to be. We start our tour with number 2, the Pearl of the Resort. Designed by Ross, it opened in 1907 to almost instant acclaim and featured the trademark turtleback greens that have now tortured players for more than 100 years. The essential character of number 2 in its early days reflected the sandhills, but over time this got lost as endless gallons of water were used to create something greener, something less native in its place. And that course, the very green one, was the one that hosted the US Open in 1999 and 2005. But for the 2014 Open, Ben Crenshaw and Bill Coore were hired to return it to its former state. They used old aerial photographs for design. They imported more than 80,000 clumps of wiregrass to replace the Bermuda grass rough. And in the process, they saved literal tons of water and made it a sandhills course again. Many people loved it, maybe even most people, but among those who didn't was Donald Trump, who in 2014 tweeted, "I'd bet the horrible look of Pinehurst translates in poor television ratings." Today, Pinehurst has 10 courses. The first was designed in 1897 by Leroy Culver, and the last, number 10, is a Tom Doak design that opened in April of this past year on a plot of 900 acres 3 miles to the south of the main resort, complete with artificial dunes created when the land was a literal sand mine. In the years between number 1 and number 10, courses 2 through 4 were designed by Ross. Number 5 was designed by his protege, Ellis Maples. Numbers 6 and 8 were designed by Tom Fazio, and number 7 came from Reese Jones. The odd man out here is a course designed by Jack Nicklaus called Pinehurst National, built independent of the resort in 1989, but which was bought by Pinehurst in 2014 and rebranded as Pinehurst number 9. Not a bad way to add another famous designer to your roster. Gil Hance is in the Pinehurst mix too, but not as the designer of an 18-hole course. In fact, Hance built the Cradle, the 9-hole short course just southwest of the clubhouse that opened in 2017. The name refers to Pinehurst's status as the so-called cradle of American golf. And here you can sip a cocktail or a beer, and you can even play barefoot. It's like you've just had a great meal playing one of the main courses, and now you want a nice, light dessert. Not far from the Cradle on your way east to number 2, there's a 12th course, Thistle Dew, and it's the smallest of all. This is a putting course, not to be confused with a putting green. The difference is it's an actual 18-hole affair. It's surprisingly vast, built in 2012, but you only need one club, the putter. The name sounds a little bit Scottish with Thistle, and maybe there's some West Asian influence with the Dew, DHU, but no, this is neither. This is a pun. Years ago, when a Pinehurst man named James Barber built the first ever miniature golf course at his home, he finished, he looked at the product, and he said, "This'll do." The name stuck, Thistle Dew. All around the Cradle and number 2 and the clubhouse and Thistle Dew, you can't miss the statues. Overlooking the 18th green in front of the clubhouse is the famous Payne Stewart statue. He was the winner here in 1999, and the statue captures him in his iconic moment of celebration, fist thrown out, leg bent back in the air as he hit the 15-foot putt that beat Phil Mickelson and won him his second US Open. Less than 6 months later, Stewart died in a plane that eventually crashed in South Dakota, and that makes this moment all the more poignant in his life and in the history of Pinehurst. Walk back southwest along the clubhouse facade and you'll come to the Putter Boy statue. And the origins of this one are interesting. He comes from old marketing material. In the original days of the resort, a character called the Golf Lad was used in ads and calendars. Eventually that was replaced, but in 1912, a sculptor named Lucy Richards based her bronze statuette on that Golf Lad. And the long putter he's holding was meant to be a kind of sundial, hence the original name, Sundial Boy. For one reason or another in the 70s, that changed to Putter Boy, and it was actually kept in the World Golf Hall of Fame from 78 to 90 before being restored to its place of prominence. The Putter Boy, or the Golf Lad, whatever you want to call him, he made his return in graphic form for the logo of the 99 and 05 Opens, and in 14, there was a lovely adjustment made to show him holding the US Open trophy just like Payne Stewart had when he won in 99. Putter Boy is back again this year, and he's holding the number 2 flag. There's a third statue that's far less famous than the first two. It's the statue of Donald Ross and Richard Tufts, which is now behind the 18th green at number 2 because they've moved the Payne Stewart statue to the spectator entrance. Ross, of course, the architect, he was with Pinehurst for more than 50 years, and one interesting little piece of history with him is that he was primed to be the designer and builder of Augusta National, but Bobby Jones passed him up for Alistair McKenzie at the last minute, and Ross dealt with that heartbreak by redesigning number 2 into its great current form. And Richard Tufts was the grandson of the founder, James Walker Tufts. He became USGA president eventually, and he ran the roost until the family sold the course to the Diamond Head Corporation in the 70s. After a controversial 10-year run where they ran up millions of dollars of debt, Club Corps would take over and restore Pinehurst to its former glory. The fourth statue you can find on the grounds is of Club Corps' founder, Robert H. Dedman. By the way, you may have noticed that Pinehurst has a great way with naming things, Thistle Dew and the Cradle and Putter Boy, other than their courses, which are just numbers, but this particular strength extends to the driving range, which they call Maniac Hill. The origin of that goes back to the players in the North-South Championship who would pound balls into oblivion on the range trying to get ready. Maniac Hill, it's got a certain ring to it. Golf is not the only sporting facility at Pinehurst. Between the west entrance of the clubhouse and the parking lot, visitors cannot miss the bright green lawn bowling court and the 3 croquet courts. And this isn't just some novelty. They've hosted championships in both games, and they actually have a croquet pro on staff. If you wanted, you could call up right now and schedule a croquet lesson. They also have tennis facilities, and they even have a livery stables and a harness track. Now we get to the buildings of Pinehurst, and we have to start with the clubhouse at 1 Carolina Vista Drive. The outside has this sweeping veranda. Part of it overlooks number 2. If you ever play there in the afternoon, you'll have an audience as you complete the 18th hole. Inside is the Donald Ross Grill and a beautiful wooden bar called the Deuce. And at the Deuce, one of the great prizes for anyone playing number 2 is a commemorative coin that you can only get if you make a 2 at any hole on the course. Elsewhere in the clubhouse are a plethora of trophies from past tournaments and plaques listing the winners of the North and South amateur events going back to the early 1900s. You can also see the sleeves Payne Stewart cut off his shirt to make a vest in 99. And an interesting feature that was just added this year is a tunnel that leads directly from the locker room in the clubhouse right to the first tee at number 2. The resort is not the only clubhouse. Now there are separate clubhouses at number 8 and one at number 9, which are far enough from the main action that they merit their own building. The halfway house that serves courses number 2 and number 4, that's called the Nest, and it was built to look like the original Pinehurst Resort clubhouse. Over here is the Dorna Cottage. That's the home Donald Ross designed and lived in. He named it after the Scottish town of his birth, and today, special guests of the resort can stay there. A little less exclusive, but no less impressive, is the Carolina Hotel, which among other things has what some have called the best breakfast in golf. True Southern cuisine, and there's even a pianist playing in the dining room. Up here is the Manor Inn, recently renovated. Inside that, they have the North and South Bar. And speaking of drinks, just a few steps away is the Pinehurst Brewing Company, which is on the site of an old abandoned steam plant. They make their own craft beers, and this place is owned by the resort, but unlike everything else there is a conscious choice not to have a totally resort feel to it. It's in the village, and they want the vibe to be very different. They want it to work for tourists and for locals. Now you get into the village. It is very quaint, very tourist-oriented. The great difference between here and the Masters is that while there's basically a wall between Augusta National and the city, here the village seems like an extension. It's integrated much better. You have places like the Pinecrest Inn, where you can go try to chip a ball into a fireplace at the bar. You've got a couple bookstores, wine shops, art galleries, places like that. And through it all, through the resorts, the courses, the village, everywhere you look, that name Pinehurst, it doesn't exist by accident. Hurst is an old English word meaning forest, and the pine trees here are everywhere. In fact, you can still experience what the very first European explorers noticed, which is that the upper reaches of the longleaf pines, when the wind's blowing, create a pleasant sound that's like the waves of the ocean, but far off, remote, as if the trees hold a distant memory from the time millions of years ago, before golf, before the sandhills, before the pine barrens, when the land itself was a great sea.